These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Now, it has been a lot of straight history lately, and for all that history is a joy, it's good to hear from the people of the ancient world from time to remember that they aren't tools in a narrative, but they are, in fact, actual humans with actual stories. And so last time I did promise a mailbag episode, but it turns out that I've spent the whole script just talking about 4 slave purchases, all made by a fellow named Nabu Tuklatua, and being slave transactions, they do in fact consider many of the humans involved instrumentally. So yeah, sometimes people kinda sorta are just tools, but we do get to see exactly how they're being sold as tools, which can be fun. Now, we don't really have a narrative through all of this, but we're just going to read some of these and see some neat details. Now, starting off with seeing humans as tools, one of the largest categories of transaction texts from the capital city of Assyria, Kalhu, are slave purchases. The largest category of texts is itself probably just real estate transactions, but between slave purchases and real estate transactions, we see these two so commonly probably because this is an artifact of just what was recorded. Way back when we looked at Ubaram's letters and documents, we noticed that it was sort of the big events in someone's life that tend to get documented, not just your everyday purchases. And so it makes sense that these big ticket items like human beings or plots of land are what get recorded. Anyway, let's open it up and see what we have. And our first document today is called Eduba 1007, and it comes from room 57 of the Northwest Palace in Kalhu. And in fact, all of our documents today will be coming from room 57 of the Northwest Palace. And if we were actual archaeologists, there are extremely valuable correlations to be studied by looking at what documents were in what rooms and what time periods are represented by each. And picking through just that detail would be a lot of fun, but it's also not gonna happen on a podcast. That's the sort of detail-oriented joy that you can only get by actually entering into the archaeological profession. Something I do recommend for any young people that happen to be listening to this show. You're already interested. You really can get a decently paying job, if a difficult one, as an archaeologist. Think about it. But the fact that we have documents from the Northwest Palace is interesting and gives us a glimpse into the Assyrian bureaucracy. You see, the structure that we now call the Northwest Palace was built by Ashurnasirpal during his construction of the city. However, Adad-nirari was the last king to live in that palace, and at some point in his reign he built himself a new palace a bit to the south, still on the upper part of the city, but you know, we all need to have new and better from time to time, so the building probably needed like a new upgrade or whatever. Anyway, after Adad-nirari no longer lived in the palace, the whole thing seems to have been converted into offices and storerooms, sort of like an ancient version of the massive bureaucratic office buildings that fill up so much of Washington, D.C. nowadays. The last king to live in the city of Kalhu at all is going to be Sargon II, and after that there won't be any more royal correspondence flowing through the Northwest Palace offices. However, it would remain a local governance center for another century until the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the associated sack of Kalhu. During the sack, it seems that a lot of enemy armies and enemies of Assyria in general went through all of these offices and storehouses, and we can assume that they stole anything worth much, but they also took a lot of the royal art and they threw it down into the various wells around the building. These would be the water wells that would have served the building, and they just sort of threw it all down in the well. And they also threw some bound guards down into the same wells to be buried alive as punishment for resisting the fall of Assyria. And of course, the enemy soldiers meant this to be a way of destroying all this fabulous art and these human lives, but they ended up preserving it all for the archaeologists because the wells then collapsed and were buried in and, formed a perfect little time capsule for us. And digging into these wells has been a literal treasure trove for the archaeologists who find them. I mean, of course, the human lives weren't preserved when they got yeeted down the well, but, they found all the manacled bodies down there, and those guys would have been dead by now anyway, so it is kind of all the same for an archaeologist. Anyway, the point is that documents from the reign of Adad-nirari would have been close to 200 years old by the time the building was sacked. The sack happens about 612 BCE. Adad-nirari, give or take 800 BCE. The documents from today are 788 and 800 according to their own dates. So yeah, close to 200-year-old documents before this administrative center was sacked. And this building was in active use until basically the end. This means that these archive rooms, where the slave trades and the land deals were held, had 200-year-old legal documents detailing some honestly pretty mundane stuff in them. And this raises the possibility that the Assyrians really did refer to quite ancient administrative texts on a fairly regular basis. I mean, that or they were just a culture of hoarders, but you don't hold on to this stuff unless you think it might get needed. But let's read this royal document real quick. Not royal document, just a regular document, real quick to get a sense of it. It opens with Hurabu, the leather dyer, Sin Ahu Idna of unknown status, and Bel Lamer, another leather dyer, at least two of whom are noted as slaves under different masters. They can't write, so they affirm that they are the agents of this document by pushing their fingernails into the clay. And we can still see these fingernail impressions right under the names. That's their signature. They're illiterate. In old American history, people would scratch a little X on their signature because, you can't push your fingernail into a piece of paper, but you can push your fingernail into a clay tablet. And I don't feel like a fingernail is very representative. Like, if you see someone's fingernail impression, can you really identify them that well? I don't know, but it was a very common way for the illiterate to mark that they were part of the creation of this document and part of this economic deal. So, anyway, after the names and the fingernails, it says, these three have carried out the procedures and assigned some lady. Her name is something like Ba something Marka something, it's hard to read, to a palace scribe named Nabu-Tuklatua to be a slave girl. It doesn't actually say to be a slave girl, it says to be his woman. We'll get into that in a second. The three men are apparently the brothers of this, we'll call her Bamarka lady, and they receive 5 mina of copper in exchange for giving their sister to Nabu-Tuklatua. Now, there's a lot that's interesting just about this very short document. But if they were holding on to this particular letter, then this transaction, probably a slave transaction for this Bamarka lady, must have been the sort of thing that people might occasionally reference even dozens of years later. And we can rightly imagine that, just think about it, a century later, there might be some dispute about the slave status of Bamarka's great-grandchild, and some scribe would need to know that this kind of tablet existed, and need to know where in the archives it might be found, and then they'd have to look tirelessly through hundreds of similar clay tablets to find this particular record. Now, surely most such records didn't actually get hunted down later on, but that's the thing about these bureaucratic records, then as now. You have to hold on to a large volume of records so that the small percentage that do get needed later on are available. Now, we think of these ancient societies as oral societies, but the Assyrian Empire, if it held on to records of individual girls being sold around, they must have also held on to other types of records. The overwhelming majority of these records have, of course, been lost, but this sort of gives us an indication of the scale and extent of the record keeping that was happening throughout Mesopotamian history. And it's hard to imagine culture after culture in this region adopting this same detailed record-keeping practice if it didn't justify the massive expenditure of skilled labor that it required. There were people in ancient Mesopotamia who did nothing for their entire professional lives except record transactions of this sort. And I mean, yeah, it's easier for them than working out in the fields, but the level of expense involved for the individual citizens who paid scribes to record the pivotal aspects of their lives, and of course the mass expense of the governments and the large businesses and the temples that employed these men en masse, must have been justified by the value of having all these records. And of course, when contemplating just how many records there must once have been, and we weep again at just how much has been lost, and how much must have existed in comparable civilizations like Sidon and Tyre, or the Indian kingdoms at the same time, which long since decayed due to the less favorable conditions of preservation in those areas. Oh, the lost records in the Northwest Palace alone should be enough for many lifetimes of powerful narratives and valuable historical lessons, if even the fragments that we have are enough to build such a detailed picture of the civilization as we have it. You just weep to see how much has been lost. Anyway, back to ancient slavery. Now, these three men appear to have been slaves, all from a family of leather dyers. The men have what appear to be Aramaean names, and one is the slave of a palace herald, while the other one or two, the text is a little unclear, are probably the slaves of a fellow named Marduk Shaduni. Despite being slaves, however, they appear to be conducting business on their own merit, sealing the document with their own fingernail imprints. Now, likely this is because they are selling their sister to a palace scribe, and this itself is interesting, as we're left to wonder what the status of the sister was prior to that. Surely a sister is not a slave of her brothers, yet if her brothers are enslaved, why was she not also the property of some master? And I'm asking questions, these are questions with a number of potential answers. But the point is, and we don't know which of those potential answers is correct, but all of this is a reminder that the category of slave was a highly variable one in ancient society. Slave families were far from uncommon in certain contexts, so this sister likely lived with one or more of her enslaved brothers, and potentially with some other women in the family, supported by the rations being paid to one or more of the slave brothers. We should probably assume that the father was also a leather dyer, and is now out of the picture, either because he's died or because the family has been uprooted during the process of their enslavement. Indeed, it could be that the brothers had been sold into slavery by their father to prevent their sister from also being sold into slavery. We don't know what actually happened in this case, but these are all live possibilities. Anyway, it's not totally clear if Bamarka is being sold as a slave either. You see, there is a specific word for a slave girl, and it's not being used in this document, though this is also not a standard marriage contract either. It may be that Nabu Tuklatua, who's the scribe purchasing Bamarka, intends her possibly to be a domestic slave, and just isn't using the word for slave for whatever reason. Or possibly she might be coming into the Nabu Tuklatua household as something more akin to a concubine. A woman of sufficiently low status wouldn't be married to someone as high up as a palace scribe in pretty much any circumstance, but seeing three brothers selling a sister could potentially speak of desperation. In which case, you could imagine a desperate family selling off a sister to save the rest of the family. On the other hand, these men are already slaves of other masters, and as such, they're unlikely to fall into starvation themselves. They're not supporting themselves anymore. Remember, this is the advantage of being a slave. It was really hard to support yourself in ancient times, so actually selling yourself or your children wasn't always the worst thing in the world. So I get the impression that the sister is being sold here because she's now come of age, but is too low in too low social standing, being the sister of slaves, to get a proper marriage. Or maybe she could get a marriage, but it wouldn't be into nearly as good of a family or nearly as lucrative as concubinage to a palace scribe. The truth is, we don't know. This is a bit of speculation, but it is an interesting situation. And the document is very short. It ends just after recording this transaction with a list of witnesses who would attest to the details of the proceedings if anyone needed to follow up on the matter. And the whole thing is dated to the month of Intercalary Adar, so something like February-ish, in the year of Adad Mushamir, which is 788 BCE. So, sort of like February-ish 788. And that Intercalary Adar is, they didn't have leap days. They had a what's called a lunisolar calendar, quite similar to the modern Hebrew calendar, and in fact, the Hebrew calendar probably comes from the Mesopotamian one. They share names for the months even. But since they didn't have leap days, but of course the calendar didn't quite match up, you got that 0.25 days approximately that sits at the end of the 365 in a standard year. So what they would do is every now and then they would add another month into the calendar. The last month would be repeated. So this was sort of the leap month of the year 788. Just a little calendar note there. Another document from the same year in the same room, which appears to have been a room for domestic records, including slave contracts. In this document, the subject is a fellow named Ashur Sharu Usur, an admirably patriotic name, which means something like Adad is the father of the king. Now, Adad Sharu Usur is the son of a fellow named Berkiah, meaning that he's actually an Aramaean who has adopted an Assyrian name, and a very patriotic one, in order to help assimilate into Assyrian society. This is something we know happened. You take not just a native-sounding name to integrate into society, but, a very patriotic one. Sort of like all the ex-slaves who ended up calling themselves, naming themselves after like George Washington and things like that. Lots of black people today have the last name of Washington because they wanted to enter into free society, taking a very patriotic name. And this is a very similar sort of thing, different context, of course. But Ashur Sharu Usur puts his fingernail into the clay, letting us know that he is illiterate, even though he's apparently quite financially successful. not at all a strange situation. Most people were illiterate, including quite a lot of kings, we think. Anyway, after his fingernail, we hear that he's finished all relevant procedures and he has sold 5 people. Marshaya, Gadiu, Minuati Ana Asher, Tanatala, and Tanatala's daughter, who, being a woman and doesn't apparently get her own name, to the same guy as bought the last transaction, Nabu Tuklatua, the palace scribe. And this transaction was done for 105 mina of copper. Now the price was paid in full in the sight of the witnesses, and the non-consensual transaction of human beings was legally affirmed. The seller, Ashusharu Usur, guaranteed all 5 of them against seizure and epilepsy for the next 100 days, and they are guaranteed to not commit any crimes for all days for the rest of their lives, on the pain of Ashusharu Usur apparently giving a refund if they turned out to be criminal slaves. After that is the list of witnesses and then the date. Now, it doesn't tell us what the particular value of these particular slaves is, because 105 divided by 5 people, that averages out to about 20 mina per person, but the price of slaves is drastically more variable in this period than it was back in the Middle Bronze Age, which I think is when we last looked into this matter rather deeply. Because the face of the ancient economy has changed so much, it's hard to say how 20 mina of copper or bronze compares to the previous 20 shekels of silver, aside from literally being about 60 times the weight value. But of course, the relative value of copper has changed between the Bronze Age and the current Iron Age. And it's precisely because there are fewer industrial uses for bronze now so it seems to have replaced silver as the primary currency. Silver, of course, is much scarcer, so what appears to be a very broad shift to copper or bronze as the primary metal for transactions should help to monetize the economy. That is to say, small amounts of copper have a lower value than small amounts of silver, so a relatively poorer person can make reasonable transactions, like for daily or weekly amounts of grain in very small amounts of copper. Whereas for the previous silver economy, most poor people may have gone their whole lives never buying or selling anything actually denominated in silver, instead selling for weights of grain or other barter-style materials, or sometimes what they would do is they would say, okay, this much grain is worth a certain amount of silver, and this many sheep is worth a certain amount of silver, and so we're going to exchange the two based on their prices denominated in silver, but we're not actually going to have any silver for ourselves. So it's sort of a halfway point between barter and monetary exchange. Anyway, we'll talk more about currencies later. It's very exciting, but there's 2 important caveats in this transaction. We're seeing records sealed within the palace of fairly high-value transactions. So we don't know just from this how deeply monetized, say, a nomadic herdsman might be, or a peasant farmer. Though in the last transaction, we did see 3 middle-class slaves sharing 5 mina of copper. Second, remember that coinage hasn't been invented yet. You don't have a mina coin of copper. A mina is a literal weight. Very roughly, a shekel is 9 or 10 grams. A mina is 60 shekels, so 2 mina is roughly a kilogram of any given substance. So 20 mina of copper is about 10 kilograms of copper. You aren't carrying that around in your pocket to the market. You're making deals with your neighbors, like I said, in the form of essentially promissory notes most of the time. Selling for so many shekels of grain, for so many shekels of beer or whatever, using these copper prices now to denominate both. After making a number of transactions, maybe you would give a small amount of copper to sort of pay off whatever remaining balance there might be, if any. Now, with these palace sales, what we were talking about is sort of like private sales, market sales, but if you're selling things in the palace, these are formally witnessed, these are large value transactions, it's far more likely that actual copper is changing hands here under the witness of the witnesses. But just in general, we should remember that pre-coinage economies were only very weakly monetized for the most part. And actually, even after coinage did become widespread, a lot of kings really struggled to monetize the rural areas under their control. We see this a lot with the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires in this same region a couple hundred years from now, because of course the Greeks were very used to monetary currency transactions, whereas they were taking over areas that very much were not used to it. And so the Hellenistic palace accounting systems really struggled to figure out how to handle the matter, and the Seleucids and Ptolemies came up with very different approaches, and then both of their kingdoms fell apart. Anyway, I've gotten way off track today. We next have another slave transaction from the same place with the same buyer, Nabu-Tuqlatua, the palace scribe. There is no clear indication that he's acting as a purchasing agent for the palace, but he is buying a significant number of slaves. I did actually think originally, oh, he's buying a lot of slaves, it must be for the palace. But actually, in at least some transactions where someone is buying things for a temple or for a palace, that does sometimes get noted on the transactions. That might be that Nabu-Tuqlatua is just so well known as being an agent for someone else that it doesn't get recorded in the transactions, but it could also be the case that he's buying them for his own merits. If he's reselling them, we have no record that he's like a wheeler dealer, flipping these slaves around or whatever. But what could be happening here is that he could be buying these slaves to work his Ilku lands. Something that we see is that at least 3 of these large transactions are happening in the same year. So it could be that he's been granted more Ilku lands recently, and he needs people to work them. Might be expanding his household. As a palace scribe, and apparently quite an important and wealthy one, he doesn't get paid just in currency directly. He might also be getting paid in currency, but a large part of his salary is in Ilku lands. This is the Ilkum system, which you might remember from the Old Babylonian period, but of course it's evolved and modified over the years. What happens now is a set of fields is rendered exempt from paying any taxes to the king or temple, whoever originally owned it, and instead the Ilku holder, who is Nabu-Tuqlatua in this case, he receives the rents or the taxes from that field. And I will say the difference between rent and taxation was a very fuzzy one in those days. But as the holder of these lands, so long as the king allowed him to continue to hold them, and there's not much chance that he's working them himself. Instead, he peoples these lands with either renters, or in this case it looks like he's filling them up with slaves to work his fields, or maybe whatever industries he might have set up in that land. And he might also have some kind of manor house near those lands as well, if he has enough income coming in from all that. We don't actually know how many assets Nabu-Tuqlatua has as a whole. As far as I know, we haven't identified him outside of these slave transactions, though I will say that might be a failure on my part. There are prosopographists who really get into the Neo-Assyrian Empire and have done a lot of great work really identifying who all these people are from the ancient history. Yes, the year 788 is apparently a very good one for Nabutukla-Tua, since we've so far seen him buy 8 slaves in 3 separate transactions. He's paid out a total of 180 mina of copper, which is a very sizable sum for a single year of purchases. Now, the 2 slaves in this last document, Shahnetu and Ahulamur, are Aramaeans, sold by Bunaya Sharu, who is palace superintendent for the high district of the city of Nineveh. So he's one elite selling off excess stock to another. Interestingly, this particular contract has a punishment line, and these are somewhat common in these legal transaction texts. When we get probably in a future episode, because we didn't get to real estate transactions, but we will see more about punishment lines later. But for now, let's look at this one. It says, whoever later initiates a lawsuit or litigation over these 2 slaves shall return the purchase price tenfold to its owner. And that's fascinating. Some of these get wild, but this one's very straightforward. And it looks like there's always a balance, you see, in a legal system. On one hand, if there's a genuine dispute between 2 parties, you want to have an open door so that a resolution can be reached in a peaceful and legal way. Having that is going to increase the authority and the legitimacy of the government, while also maintaining peace among the people. You gotta have a legal system. In an advanced, complex society like this, at least. However, handling a dispute is inherently time-consuming, and the possibility of lawfare will always arise. Now, lawfare is when you start pernicious lawsuits that have perhaps little chance of winning in order to tie up your enemy's time and resources and possibly even cause them to lose social standing. Now, formal lawsuits have been a part of the fabric of Mesopotamian society for at least as long as writing, possibly going back as far as the foundation of their cities in the pre-literate period, making the Mesopotamian legal tradition 2,000 to 4,000 years old at this point. And so, you've got to imagine the question of lawfare has long been considered, and it appears to have been largely solved with these punishment clauses, or at least solved to the contentment of the society at large. Now, the clause itself, whoever initiates a lawsuit shall. I mean, in a sense it's very clear, but in a sense it's also unclear. Is the matter in this document now wholly closed off from further litigation? Or is it the case that any further litigation would require this very high upfront fee in order to have the courts even consider it, this 10 times the purchase price thing? Or is it that anyone who initiates these lawsuits and is then unsuccessful would have an automatic penalty applied to him? I'm not sure that we know. Now, the text in English seems to lean towards the second option, but Akkadian written grammar is different from English and includes less detail than I think is inherent in the English translation. And so there could have been a bit that's implied that would have just been widely known but not written down that would affect our understanding of all this. Still, these punishment clauses can be hilarious. Like, you have to drink a vat of tanner's fluid sometimes, which is basically rotten animal fat and concentrated urine in a cup, or in a vat, for these punishment clauses, which I definitely think drinking vats of urine should be brought into the U.S. legal system somewhere. Definitely. I don't know where. Anyway, moving on to our fourth document. It's in the year 800, which is actually before the first three, but I didn't organize these chronologically. I didn't really organize them at all, besides just putting all the Nabutukla-Tua ones together. But in the year 800, so 12 years before these earlier transactions, Nabu-tuklatua purchased a family. Emuki Asher, his wife, his 3 sons, and his daughter, who were all slaves of Nabu-ahu Idna, son of Nabu-shuma Ibni, were sold for 180 mina of bronze. Now this family would likely have been kept together and put on a field and a house somewhere and lived much like free farmers, but, without the free part of all that. The thing is, though, how different their lives were from their neighbors who were free and farming the same fields, but then paying taxes on that field, versus this family who is unfree and paying slave rents to their Ilku landlord. How different did that look in practice is very hard to know for sure. Anyway, thinking about all the prices that we've seen today, it's very interesting that we don't have a per-person price that seems very standardized. Looking at letters that I didn't actually read for you today because we're already quite long, I have seen some where a person is being sold for as little as 3 or 4 mina of copper, whereas others go for like 60 mina of copper individually. It's hard to tell with the group sales if they were all of the same value or not, or if being in a group had its own value. Like, was it volume discounts, or was it, hey, people tend to do better when they're in a family, so having this whole family economic unit sold together, there might be extra value in that. I don't know that it's known at all, and certainly I don't know, if that makes sense. So we can't properly just take the average price, divide it by the number of people in a particular contract, and then call it a day. But we can say that those with particular skills definitely go for more, while women, whose ability to perform heavy field labor is more limited, women tend to go for less. But beyond that, we note that every price has been denominated not in shekels of silver, but in mina of bronze or copper. And the thing is, 1 shekel of silver, remember this, in theory, is about a mina of copper. And so these are kind of equivalent in a theoretical sense. But of course, the exact ratio of prices changes a lot. The economic distinction between bronze and copper is very hard to read in the ancient texts. And given the very highly variable nature of ancient bronze, like, you don't have 2 different metals. One is copper and one is 90% copper, 10% tin. You have different percentages of copper, each of them with different mix-ins of other metals. It's not very scientific. It is kind of, it's artisanal. It's well thought out, but they clearly didn't have a great control over how much metal was in their bronze. So it's not always clear if they knew whether they were holding copper and bronze in any given circumstance. Certainly pure bronze, real good bronze, you can tell from copper, but lightly alloyed is much harder to tell. And when you put other minerals in the mix, that gets things more complicated. And in the written record, it's not always easy to tell copper, bronze, and brass from each other. But aside from all that, the mere fact that copper has become the currency of choice represents an absolutely massive shift in the economy. You see, on the silver side, it's not clear whether the amount of silver circulating in the economy has changed very much. The primary sources of silver in the ancient Near East were Anatolia for the most part, and certainly the Bronze Age collapse would have disrupted silver mining. But also the regional economy as a whole was disrupted, so demand might have matched supply there. Or there could have been a mismatch, we just don't know, but the whole thing was a big mess. More importantly, there's a big question mark around how organized the interior of Anatolia was during the 10th and 9th centuries, as the Near East is re-stabilizing and Assyria is growing. Large-scale mining operations require a lot of men to be mobilized in the digging, and then they require a degree of regional stability to allow for food surpluses in the nearby farms to feed the men who are in the mines, as well as the stability to allow trade caravans to travel around, first bringing food and supplies to the mines, and then taking the resulting product to market to make it all profitable. Now, small-scale mining can occur in certain areas, but that likely won't be enough to supply the rising economies of the entire Near East. With the growth in the wider economy, demand for silver is going to steadily increase, yet supply is going to remain constrained, causing the value to rise because, of course, Anatolia is kind of chaotic, so the supply is constrained there. And now, I am going to suggest a possibility, though I don't know that we have hard data, that the area of central Anatolia might have been fed in part by a rise in the value of silver, as the local lords who had their small mining operations would have received outsized value from those small mining operations because they're the only suppliers in a supply-constrained area, while the wider economy is demanding more and more silver. So maybe some of these local Anatolian lords who did have small mining operations were able to reinvest those outsized profits into their kingdoms. And this may have been part of the origin story of Phrygia. More on that soon. But not today. So on one hand, the value of silver is rising. On the other hand, with the introduction of iron into the region and the gradual replacement of a lot of bronze tools with cheaper iron replacements, the price of copper is absolutely plummeting. There were times in the late Bronze Age when we could fairly compare the price of high-quality bronze to the price of gold, but there is now at least 100-fold difference in value in the Assyrian capital, if these legal documents are anything to go by. Remember that, to a large extent, all the copper and bronze that has ever been mined and smelted is still in the Assyrian economy. A broken or worn-out copper tool might be discarded, but the metal within it can be taken down to the local redsmith and have it infinitely reforged. And so as the bronze tools get worn out, in the past, you might have taken it to your local redsmith, that's someone who works with copper, and had them melt it down and restore it to new glory. But now, instead of recycling that old copper tool, you are now replacing it with iron. So what happens to that weight of bronze from that tool? You're not going to just throw it out. Bronze has always had currency value, so you're going to sell it at weight for grain or sheep or land or slaves. Except that over the last 200 years, everyone has been slowly making the bronze to iron transition with a lot of their tools, meaning that the effective supply of bronze on the market, no longer tied up in these long-term capital investments of tools, has absolutely ballooned. At the same time, the primary source of bronze demand, which was again that same need to make more tools, has just cratered with the switch to iron. There are still uses for copper and bronze, even among tools and weapons. And we saw it in a previous episode, bronze is generally lighter and can take a finer blade than iron at this point in history. So things like helmets and swords are going to remain a mix of bronze and iron, kind of based on personal preference and economic conditions for the rest of the Assyrian Empire. But the big picture has changed, leading to a significant shift in currency. Now, how big a change was this, actually? For a modern example, when France shifted from francs to euros, there was a certain amount of transition cost involved in that, but it was managed over a few years, and the actual economic impact was minimal in view of how big the French economy is. The silver to copper shift in Mesopotamia, however, that's a matter of centuries, and a lot of that shift seems to have occurred in a period that was already very chaotic and dark, so the transition costs were probably minimal in and of themselves. So we can't say that this currency rebasement was a great transition in the minds of the people living it. The properties of copper versus silver do mean that larger amounts of copper are required for larger transactions. Remember that about 20 mina is a kilogram of copper, more or less. And so some of those slave prices, like 185 mina for that family of 5, that's 9 kilograms of copper. That's not an insignificant thing to be lugging around, not exactly something that's going to fit in your coin purse the way that a few shekels of silver would have back in the Bronze Age. Now, this raises costs for the top of society and for international trade, increasing the friction of large purchases. At the same time, the ability to have a few shekels of copper brings more of the lower classes into the monetary system, with the natural consequence that more and more poor farmers can participate in the labor markets of the empire. This is boosting urbanization and market participation, growing the economy overall. Bottom line, how often do we see things that benefit the poor and the overall economy at the expense of the elites? Not that often, and seeing this really brings a smile to my poor, dead economist heart. Anyway, we're pretty long now. I did have like 25 documents to look through, and we've gotten through 4. But I had fun doing it. And I will do more transactions in the future. Some of you are cheering now, some of you are groaning, but I'm having a ton of fun. So we're also going to find some actual letters here kind of soon, but next time we're going to move on to a sort of more tangential topic. I mentioned Graham Hancock back in my Semiramis episode, and I realized that, in fact, I was wrong to comment on Hancock without properly explaining myself. And so, next time we're going to look a bit at his theory of a lost Ice Age civilization. But the point isn't just going to be to dunk on a marginalized theory. Having now read a few of his books, I realize that the issue involved goes deeper than any of his specific claims, but all the way into the philosophy of archaeology. So join us next time as we ask questions like, what is the past? How is it recoverable? And how are inferences formed in the historical sciences? And don't forget that I have Egyptian myth bonus episodes over on Patreon and for YouTube channel members, thanks to those who have been supporting the podcast through those and in other ways. And as always, thank you for listening.